Hi everyone. So this video is going to cover the affirmative state and specifically the ways in which the affirmative state is sort of under attack or being undermined. Um, this kind of fits nicely with some of the stuff that we talked about previously with regard to voting and social problems related specifically to the electoral process. So the affirmative state is defined as a state that plays a kind of energetic and positive role in a society by solving collective problems and by advancing public purposes. What sometimes derisively today gets called big government. Big government isn't necessarily pejorative, although it certainly does get used that way a lot. But if you think about the New Deal, if you think about the responses of the FDR administration to some of the vulnerabilities in the economy and among the citizens that was exposed in the wake of the stock market crash and the Great Depression back in the 1920s and 1930s, sometimes government is the spender of last resort, right? So in an economy that is roughly 71% consumer spending, when consumers don't have the ability to sustain economic activity through consumption, states are sometimes challenged in their ability to do this because while they are large economic actors, states don't have as much economic flexibility, nor do they have the scale to operate the way that the federal government does. So the federal government stepping in and providing government spending and work programs in the 1930s and the 1940s, or the federal government stepping in the wake of the pandemic that began in the spring of 2020 and providing stimulus checks and providing other kinds of financial benefits to people who suddenly found themselves unable to continue to spend because many people had to take time off work, right? So government is usually well positioned to step in and kind of fill that gap, to address that void. One of the things that sort of interferes with the ability to for governments to step in and take on that role, whether we're talking about city governments, state governments, or federal government, are the implementation of what we call austerity measures. So austerity measures are basically a set of economic policies that are implemented with an aim to reducing government budget deficits, right? So government often, well, actors in government, politicians, will often take a stand in which they sort of enunciate or proclaim sort of the problems of deficit spending. We can't spend more money than we're taking in. Sort of equating the federal government with a family sitting around the kitchen table trying to budget so that they can make ends meet month to month, right? We can't spend more money than we're taking in. Well, the truth is, I mean, at the federal level, certainly at the federal level, the government can absolutely spend more money than it takes in. The degree to which it can sustain that is certainly something that we have debates about. But the federal government is always in a position to spend more money than it has, and the federal government has an advantage in doing that over state governments. State governments can't print their own money. State governments are often shackled by laws or policies that are in place that require, for example, the submission of a balanced budget, a budget in which we are not taking in more than we're not spending more than we're taking in. But at the federal level, that that isn't the case. The federal government can absolutely spend more money than it takes in, especially in response to a crisis. But the degree to which the the desire to avoid deficit spending has kind of taken root at every level of government spending, what we find often in response to a crisis is, instead of the state sort of stepping up and stimulating economic activity through transfer payments to consumers, debt relief, things of that nature, what often happens is that governments will scale back what they spend, and to the extent that reduces services for people in society, or to the extent that actually reduces, say, for example, public sector employment, you end up with kind of a spiral effect, right? That government is taking in less revenue, so they spend less money. The material effect of spending less money is that people who work in government often find themselves either having their hours reduced, or they end up losing their job, which means less money in the economy, which leads to further austerity measures, which leads to less money, and we get these kind of downward spirals. So austerity measures typically are going to fall hardest on the lower classes and the working classes, in part because those classes are much more dependent on social services that are funded by the state. But they are also often, especially when we get into the lower middle class professional work that's done by women and women of color, especially those people, to the extent that they work in public sector occupations, they find themselves suddenly out of work or looking at reduced hours, which means that the cost of services is going to go up, which means more money is being diverted from consumption into meeting the necessities like your electric bill, or services that used to be covered at least in part by the state. So we've seen the implementation of austerity measures in response to economic crises, and the net effect of the implementation of those austerity measures is that the crises actually become worse than they would have been had the government stepped up and infused the economy with capital for consumption. What we often see, instead of that, the government will cut taxes, or target certain kinds of relief or certain kinds of benefits to businesses, less so to consumers. We saw kind of an interesting mix in the wake of the pandemic. We saw support for renters, to allow them to continue to be able to make rent payments, which is arguably a good thing. You saw a pause in student loan payments. That was also arguably a very good thing, because it allowed people who had student loan debt to postpone diverting limited capital toward paying off those debts, and allowing them then to take the money they had and use it to buy groceries and to pay their utilities and to do things like that. But you also saw a real hesitancy to raise taxes on the places in the economy where revenue was still being generated. So you saw the massive increase in the wealth of corporations like Amazon and Home Depot and Lowe's, and retailers like Target, a number of different food companies, McDonald's and Chipotle and companies like that. All of those companies did really, really well because they were able to provide food and home supplies, And of course, Amazon, sort of the online retailer of choice for most Americans, all of those companies did very, very well in the context of a pandemic where brick and mortar places were closed or were operating under limited capacity. But instead of trying to capture some of the growth in the value of those companies and then using those resources to support out of work people and small businesses, we actually just saw their wealth grow tremendously, and the federal government didn't really do anything to try to capture any of that, to put it to use to offset the cost of the services and emergency supports that they were supplying during the pandemic. All right, so the strategies that are being used to sort of undermine or attack the affirmative state are basically, there are 5 strategies. All of these are in place. All of these have been used to significant degree over the last 30 or 40 years. So the attack on the affirmative state isn't a new thing. Ronald Reagan, who was elected president back in 1980, very famously ran on a message of not just reining in federal spending, but attacking the very idea that the government could be a force for good, for benefit to the broad, what we used to call the public welfare. The social welfare of our society. Famously said in one of his regular lines in his speeches during the 1980 campaign was that the scariest words in the English language are "I'm from the government, I'm here to help." Again, sort of attacking the legitimacy of the idea that government could actually do things well, in spite of. And again, I want to point out that the 20th century is a textbook example of government stepping in and improving the lives of everybody. So the interstate highway system was a federally funded program that allowed interstate travel, not just for the transfer of goods and raw materials to and from marketplaces and factories, but for everyday people to go from point A to point B much more easily than they used to do that, say in the 1930s and 1940s. The condition of American roads was garbage before the interstate highway system, or it was a patchwork. Some places had really good roads, other places had very poor roads, but getting from New York to Los Angeles would take weeks because of the variable quality of roads. Rural electrification, right? The generation of electric power and the delivery of that electric power to rural areas in the United States, right? Markets aren't going to do that, right? There are some places where the opportunity for profit is so limited because people are sort of, scattered, or there aren't very many consumers within a geographic region, that there was no way that private companies were going to step in and risk capital and invest capital to kind of generate a profit, because there isn't really profit to be made. Even today, right? If you look at the 21st century, and you look at alternatives to the postal service, things like UPS or FedEx or some of these other private delivery companies, they won't actually do sort of the last mile of delivery, right? So you get some very rural location with a population of maybe 3 or 4 dozen people. It's going to be very, very cost prohibitive for Amazon, or for UPS, or for FedEx or DHL or some of these other delivery services to extend their services to those places. And so what they will often do is they'll utilize the United States Postal Service, which is constitutionally mandated to deliver mail everywhere. So there are just some things that the federal government will always be able to do that the private sector won't, right? So the development of the internet was publicly funded. And now private companies are able to take advantage of it and generate tremendous wealth for themselves and for their shareholders. But but a private company would not have created the internet, right? The investment, the upfront investment, with no guarantee of a return on that investment, would not provide sufficient incentives for those kinds of investments. We're seeing it now, right? The rural broadband, right, high-speed internet in rural areas is not something that AT&T or Comcast or Time Warner or any of these large corporations is going to go out of their way to deliver. And so the federal government is stepping in with investments to sort of guarantee that people in these remote areas of the country have access to high-speed internet. It's easy for a company to justify investing the money necessary to provide internet service in a dense urban center like the Chicago metropolitan area or the New York metropolitan area or the Los Angeles metropolitan area, because one, it's not that big, relatively speaking, and the concentration of customers in that space is going to make it worth their while. You get outside of those locations and suddenly the incentive for the private sector to do all of that kind of goes away. So first of all, sort of reject, I think it's useful to sort of reject on the surface this idea that the federal government, isn't going to do anything well compared to the private sector. There are some things for which the private sector is really, really good at providing. But there are some services and some things that the federal government does far better and far more efficiently and far more effectively. In part because they're not driven by a need to generate profit. So they don't have the same cost-benefit calculation, except, of course, more recently, as we've tried to impose those kinds of restrictions on the private or on the public sector, right? So these austerity measures, in part, are an effort to sort of apply a cost-benefit framework from the private sector onto public sector activity, with the result being that the government scales back its economic investments when the cost of those investments outweigh or outpace the revenue that's coming in. All right, so I said 5 strategies used to attack the affirmative state, going back to at least the 1980s, if not earlier. And they are as follows: cutbacks in publicly funded programs, deregulation, lax enforcement of existing regulation, privatization, and what we call public-private partnerships, specifically in the delivery of social services. So I want to briefly, because I think the chapter does a really nice job of kind of elaborating on these, but I do want to briefly sort of explain what each of these things means. So when we cut back on publicly funded programs, what we're doing is we're undermining the ability of the federal government and sometimes even state governments to deliver services to their constituencies, right? To the people who live in the country or the people who live in the state. So we cut back on Pell Grants. The cutting back of government expenditure on higher education, grant spending, not public investments, but grant spending specifically, we shift the burden onto students and their parents to come up with the money for tuition. The option that's left when grant funding declines will be student loans. And not surprisingly, the consequence of that is both higher cost because everybody was paying for Pell Grants, through their taxes. But the cost to the person going to college is going to be higher if only the people going to college are paying for it, right? So the cost of the service goes up. And the result of shifting money away from publicly funding that is that not only that the cost goes up, but now the cost is high enough that the only way to sort of realistically cover the cost of these programs is through debt, right? So you end up leaving college with tens of thousands of dollars in debt. So that's one example of a way in which cutting back publicly funded programs actually undermines the ability of the state to do things that benefit everyone, right? I mean, obviously, students who get college degrees benefit from having those credentials, but the society as a whole benefits from a better trained workforce, students who are capable of self-directed learning, which is great because most of the skills necessary in a particular occupational category are kind of obsolete within a decade. So you can either keep going back to school to learn the new skills, or you develop the capacity to learn the new skills as they evolve, as they emerge into whatever occupation you happen to be working. So that's the first strategy. The deregulation strategy is that businesses, the philosophy behind it is that businesses don't flourish in the face of regulations, right? So restrictions on how businesses are able to operate create inefficiencies. Now, this is kind of, in a lot of ways, antithetical to capitalism. Capitalism is, in principle at least, a system in which the cost of a good or a service at the point of consumption is a reflection of the total cost of producing those goods or those services. So if you go to buy a car, the cost of that automobile is all of the raw materials that went into making that car, the energy used in the assembly of its parts, the labor that's used to put all those vehicles parts together, the marketing campaign, the transportation of the automobile from the factory to the dealership, right? All of that stuff is supposed to be embedded in the cost. There are a lot of things, however, that are not going to just automatically wind up embedded in the cost if companies are able to find ways to sort of externalize those costs. So, for example, the energy production necessary to build a car generates pollution, right? It generates waste, but the cost of that is actually going to be borne by everyone, whether you have a car or not. It's going to be borne by the fact that the air quality and the environmental quality as a result of pollution will go down for everyone. But also, of course, if we want to remediate that, if we want to try to offset the effects of that, that's going to take money, right? So cleaning up landfills, cleaning up toxic waste that builds up in the environment as a byproduct of the manufacturing process, that's kind of collectivized. The cost of taking care of that is shouldered by everybody. So regulation is meant to sort of course correct for that, to make sure that businesses are operating in a way that protect the interests of workers, that protect the quality of the environment, that maintain workplace safety, that minimize the risk and the cost of the manufacturing process to society. But of course, what companies want to do is they want to find a way to privatize the profit from their economic activity while socializing as much of the cost of it as possible. So when colleges and universities teach students career-specific skill sets, the companies are the beneficiaries of that, but the companies aren't paying your tuition. You're paying your tuition. And by extension, the community is subsidizing your education. So the community is, in essence, subsidizing a corporation. Or if Walmart very famously kind of gets a lot of attention for this, but other corporations that pay at or near minimum wage are also sort of in the same boat. Part of the reason why Walmart can offer such low wages to its workers is because the federal government will step up and kind of fill in um, the gaps that are created by the cost of living versus the wages that you're earning. So if you work at Walmart, um, you may qualify, even though you're working full time, you may qualify for things like housing subsidies or supplemental nutrition assistance programs, right? So all kinds of benefits that will offset the fact that you're not earning enough money to actually be able to support yourself. The federal government will step up and say, we'll take care of that. That's the taxpayers subsidizing the profits of Walmart, right? Because by Walmart not having to pay its workers as much because the federal government is going to step in and address that deficiency, we're basically paying Walmart to pay us less money than they would need to if they were genuinely competing for labor, right? So one of the things that's happened in the last, 40 years or so, maybe 50 years, is a concerted effort to deregulate business, to take the weights off of business and let it just sort of flourish and compete and thrive. And what that's meant, of course, is shifting the cost of manufacturing and shifting the cost of business off of the companies that produce goods and services onto the society at large, not the consumer consuming the product, but the society as a whole, including people who aren't consuming the product. So that's what deregulation does to kind of erode the effectiveness of the state to make people's lives better, right? We're shouldering more and more of the cost, which means we have less resources to do other things. Coupled with that is the third strategy, which is, as I mentioned, lax enforcement. We do have regulations on the books, but if the resources necessary to enforce those regulations are not in place, then for all intents and purposes, you don't really have um, um, a regulatory structure. There was a sort of famous workplace disaster years ago now. I'd have to look up the specifics, but in the town of West Texas, I know we always say West Texas and you think of like Laredo or Waco or something like that, but West is the name of the town. So in West Texas, there was a fertilizer plant that blew up several years ago. It blew up because the company was improperly storing the combustible materials that are used to make fertilizer, things like ammonium nitrate and things like that. So the factory just, blew up and killed a number of people, and would have actually done more damage were the local elementary school, which was located kind of right adjacent to the factory, had that actually been a school day when the factory blew up, the death toll might have been much, much higher. There are regulations in place that dictate how companies are supposed to store things like combustible materials. The problem is that the schedule on which these factories were being inspected is a function of how many inspectors you have. So you got a lot of factories and very few inspectors. So the cycle for inspection for these fertilizer plants is, like once every 25 years you get an inspection, because there just simply aren't enough people that work for the state or that work for the federal government who will step in then and make sure that the company is in compliance with all of these regulations. So the regulations are on the books, but they're not being enforced. So that's kind of a problem. Privatization, more and more of the function of the state is actually being sort of privatized. So that kind of speaks for itself. If services require people to purchase those services as opposed to services that are available because they've already been paid for through taxation, that creates a very different sort of state and a very different sort of social conditions for the people who live in that society. We can look at, for example, the provision of healthcare in the United States. healthcare is provided overwhelmingly through private agents, private actors. So health insurance companies, privately owned hospitals, doctors who work for themselves, right? We don't have a single payer system. We don't have a national healthcare system. I know that we have the Affordable Care Act, but the Affordable Care Act simply requires people to purchase privately owned or purchase health insurance through privately owned corporations. Again, all of whom are doing this for a profit, which means that the cost per consumer is going to be higher because there's a profit motive involved. When you compare the what we call overhead, which is basically the operating costs, when you compare the overhead of a privately owned health insurance company and you compare it to the overhead for Medicaid or Medicare, federally funded healthcare programs, you're looking at 11 or 12% versus 3%. So a significant amount of savings in the administrative in the administration of healthcare, because the federal government doesn't need to make a profit; they just need to cover their operating expenses. Harper College is a really good example, right? It's inexpensive relative to private schools, in part because Harper doesn't need to make money. We can't really afford to lose money, but you know that the tuition that you pay is the cost of the instructors and the physical facilities of the campus and the administrators. And that's it, right? We everything else, as long as we cover our operating expenses, we can afford to keep the tuition at that level because there's no profit motive involved. So privatization has the effect of kind of undermining this idea that the state could step up and do these things much better and for less money, or at least as well and for less money than the private sector is doing them. And then, of course, the last one that I mentioned is what we call public-private partnerships. So when we take say, for example, good example from Harper. So years ago, Harper used to actually run a number of satellite cafes and places around campus where students could eat. So in J Building across from the theater box office where Studio V is now, used to be a little sort of quasi cafe. You could get some hot coffee, you could get some soup, you can get some sandwiches, plenty of things like chips and candy bars and stuff like that. So it was like a little place in J Building and I Building where people could grab a quick lunch without having to go all the way over to A Building. And they had one in Avante. They had one in over in L, I believe, in L Building by the Black Box Theater. And the college, the board of trustees of the college said, this is costing us money every year, right? We're not making a profit off of this. It's money that we're spending. Let's contract with some outside provider. And so we drew up a contract. We sent it out for bids, and we got Sodexo. And Sodexo came in and said, "Oh, we can give you a Starbucks, and we can give you a Subway." And we got a Subway and we got a Starbucks. Now, those are not owned by Subway and Starbucks. They're licensed to Sodexo, who actually run that operation. So we shifted the provision of food and snacks away from the school and onto this private outside contractor, who are now doing it for a profit. And what's happened, of course, is the number of places, the number of what we call satellite cafes, the number of satellite cafes on the campus has dropped. There are fewer of them now. And the hours at which they operate are less than what they were operating before. So we're getting worse service. The cost to students is higher because these companies charge more money. And of course, the college likes it in spite of all of that, because now they don't have that line item as part of their operating budget. And they can say, see, look, we're saving money. Well, the college is saving money, but students aren't saving money, and students aren't being less inconvenienced, right? It's more inconvenient because if I want a meal, I have to go much farther now to get a meal from my office in J building than, when I first started at Harper. So again, this idea that the only way that a state organization like say Harper College could provide this service is through a partnership with some outside vendor, and that's of course because government has decided to not spend money on providing the things that they used to provide. And the philosophy behind this, the idea behind all of it, is this thing called neoliberalism. And neoliberalism as an ideology, remember, anything that ends with ISM is often, or more often than not, going to be a reference to a belief, right, or an idea. So neoliberalism is the idea that free markets, independent or unimpeded by government regulation and government interference, do a much better job at solving problems than do states. And that can be states like Illinois, or that can be states like the United States. So neoliberalism as a philosophy, as an underlying ideology to justify and organize how the state operates, has become the dominant ideology of the late 20th and now the early 21st century. So next time, we're going to talk about the impact that all of this has on what we call civic engagement, right? The sense of connectedness that people have to a broader set of public responsibilities and efforts to address public needs. So we'll talk about that a little bit in the next video. So in the meantime, if you have any questions, obviously reach out, let me know. And if not, I'll just see you next time. So take care.